murky, dangerous, and outright corrupt. 5 words often used to describe me and Bob, but it's also the world inhabited by today's guest. Episode 21 it is.
This is Partners in Crime with Adam Croft and Robert Dawes.
Hello.
Hello, thank you for that introduction. You should be my agent.
I'm really selling you, aren't I? It's Friday again, so...
yes, it is. Well, it is. Well,
the 21st Friday in a row.
Well, our souls may be murky, Adam, but the weather outside is delightful. Blue skies.
It's been a wonderful week, yes. Very much enjoying the garden, enjoying the fruits of my labours out there. But
yes, and a few other things, it has to be said.
Yes. Some fruits that have been turned into cider tends to help.
Yes.
I was reading something in the news earlier this week. We all, we write our detectives and we have our own particular characters, but it seems that the world of real world detectives in the UK could very soon be changing. In fact, it could have people who have been out of university for barely 12 weeks could be detectives working on future murder cases.
Oh, yes. Fast tracking.
Yes, the BBC have reported that graduates can become detectives in a matter of weeks with the help of the new fast track training programme. A 12-week scheme is being developed in response to a shortfall of 5,000 investigators across England and Wales. So you can come out of university, be a graduate, and within 12 weeks you could be working on serious crimes.
Well, I think that's interesting because I've just been writing about that myself, not to mention my own book. But in the latest book, I've got one of my characters, Consuela Danaher, who's a Spanish police officer, who has been promoted to the rank of inspector at the age of 27, which is part of an initiative to actually fast-track women to the higher ranks of the police force, something that is been neglected for forever in some forces. So I've been actually exploring those possibilities, and can someone actually move that quickly through the ranks? And I've spoken to several people, and they say they can. It is possible in the modern police force. So if they're beginning to do it over here, I think they've already begun it abroad. So
well, it's an unfortunate necessary thing because there is apparently a shortfall of 5,000 police detectives that we are short by across England and Wales. It's been called a national crisis by Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary and Fire and Rescue Services. Apparently 1 in 5 detective desks is either empty or filled with unqualified staff. So it does seem a bit of an odd move just to lower the bar for qualification so that they're not unqualified, because it's much easier to qualify.
Oh, yeah, I suppose so. But, well, who knows? Where are we going? One day people being arrested by 14-year-olds.
Well, if you've been a victim of a serious crime, then I suppose you just want the case to be solved. You want the perpetrators to be brought to justice, whether that person has been a detective for 20 years or 20 days.
Well, there's no question. I mean, looking into foreign police forces, I mean, they're huge stresses. Fewer people joining the forces, less money to support police work and whatever. So these initiatives, I guess, are brought about by that need. The one I was writing about, as I say, was a way of actually, fast promoting, the talent of women police officers to the top ranks of which in certain countries there are very few.
No, absolutely. It's and we'll be speaking to our guest very shortly, who I'm sure will have insight into the inner workings of the legal system, shall we say?
Yes, he certainly will. We'll introduce him in a second, and it has to be said, he certainly knows his stuff. But here's my recommendation for the week, Simon.
Are we going legal?
Simon, I'm calling you Simon now. What's your name? No, it's Adam, isn't it? Simon is the name of our guest. This is early in the morning, listeners, and I've only had half a cup of coffee, so I'm not really at full speed. But here we are. Now, as it is a legal thriller episode this week, specialising in that. More on that in a little bit. I have chosen my recommendation for the week to be John Grisham's novel Camino Island, and it may come as a surprise to some people that this isn't a legal novel at all, a legal thriller. For once, he's actually gone off-piste and has written something else. It's a fascinating book. I'll just read a little bit about it. It's the most daring and devastating fascinating heist in literary history targets a high-security vault located deep beneath Princeton University. Valued at $25 million, though some would say priceless, the 5 manuscripts of F. Scott Fitzgerald's only novels are amongst the most valuable in the world. After an initial flurry of arrests, both they and the ruthless gang of thieves who took them have vanished without trace. Now it falls to struggling writer Mercer Mann to crack a case that has thwarted the FBI's finest minds. The Sunday Times is
good.
yes, well, it does. Do you know what? It's been a bit of a Marmite book, and when I say Marmite, that doesn't affect John Grisham as it might others, because it is still a huge international best-selling book. Though some people have gone, as very often, no, we don't like him writing like this. We buy him to read this sort of fiction.
I've never understood the phrase Marmite effect. I mean, for those listeners who aren't in the UK, Marmite is a kind of a yeast extract spread, and its whole marketing thing for decades has been you either love it or hate it. Personally, I can take it or leave it.
Is it Marmite or John Grisham's latest book?
No, Marmite.
Oh right,
it's fine. I'm not. It's not. I wouldn't say I love it, and I certainly don't hate it.
I love Marmite. Yeah, on some toast
nice
with some
enough.
baked beans on top. It's heaven. Anyway, what was it? Oh yes, John Grisham. Yes. Well, I have read it, and I think it's a wonderful book set on Camino Island, which is obviously off the Florida island, off the coast of Florida, where an island
as Florida islands tend to be,
where they tend to be located. It's very laid back in places, and it is. But I think it's a fascinating investigation into a modern crime. I had no idea that famous literary works, original literary works that are sort of kept under high security as these one. I think these actually exist. He's built this story around manuscripts which Scott Fitzgerald actually wrote, and of course there are many other writers. Hemingway, I'm sure, has got some of his original manuscripts buried away in high security vaults.
One of his old laptops.
One of his old laptops, the one you put the coal in the back
his old
of.
iPad.
Yes. It was a fascinating insight into another sort of crime, one that I wasn't aware of, and with all the usual style and panache and wry humour that you'd expect with a John Grisham book. I mean, I know he's the big boy. I think he's yet again and again and again the biggest selling author in the world. So sometimes I think we should leave them alone. They look after themselves and not give them a shout out. But it's a great holiday read, I'd say. So if you fancy whiling away a few hours on an island off the Florida coast in the company of John Grisham with his new tale, I recommend it. That's John Grisham, Camino Island.
Sounds fantastic. We should point out at this moment in time that the podcast is very gratefully sponsored by Kobo. If you want to get 90% off of your first ebook at Kobo, which of course you do, then head over to kobo.com, check out a book. We highly recommend either that particular book there, Camino Island by John Grisham, or one by today's guest. I think you should perhaps hold off until you've heard from him, because I think you'll quite like the sound of his books. Head over to kobo.com, find the book, and enter the promo code CRIME at the checkout, and the lovely folks at Kobo will give you 90% off of your first ebook. You don't need a special reader either, do you, Bob? Even though they are lovely. You can download the free app for your phone or tablet.
Did you notice I added a little bit of a...
You've extended the whistle.
It's an impressive offer, and as you say, you don't need one of their delicious tablets, but they're worth getting. They are,
yes,
really,
and there's a new one
lovely
out as well that we're going to be talking about very soon.
Yes,
a new offering from Kobo.
Our guest today is Simon Michael, the author of the best-selling London 1960s noir gangster series featuring his anti-hero barrister Charles Holborne. Now, Simon writes from personal experience. A barrister for 37 years, he worked in the Old Bailey and for other criminal courts, defending and prosecuting a wide selection of murderers, armed robbers, con artists and other assorted villainy. The 1960s was the Wild West of British justice, a time when the Krays, the Richardsons and other violent gangs fought for control of London's organised crime, and the corrupt Metropolitan Police beat up suspects, twisted evidence and took a share of the criminal proceeds. Simon weaves into his thrillers genuine court documents from cases on which he worked on the big stories of the 1960s. Simon's theme is alienation. Holborne, who dabbled in crime and in serious violence before becoming a barrister, is an outsider both in the East End, where he grew up, and in the temples of the law, where he faces daily class and religious prejudice. Well, that's Simon Michael's hero, Charles Holborne. His fourth book, Corrupted, is about to be published, and he's on the line with us today. Hello, Simon. How are you?
Good morning, gentlemen. Yes, I'm very well indeed. Thank you.
Thanks very much for joining us. Now, we've much neglected the area of legal crime fiction on the podcast so far. So as we go into our 21st episode,
yes.
Is this? You are 21 today.
Thank you very much.
You're our 21st guest. We thought we'd put that right. So the first question I'm going to ask you is a simple one. Why the 1960s?
Oh, the 1960s was a perfect time for crime, from my perspective, for the reasons you've already given in your introduction. There was the gang violence. At that time, the gangs were fighting for the proceeds of the crime, like protection, prostitution, pornography. Gambling was still illegal. So they were busy carving up their territories with fire bombs, shotguns, and razor blades. And at the same time, the Metropolitan Police were almost institutionally corrupt. I mean, everyone's heard of the Sweeney,
Yes.
and you'll know the TV series. Well, the Sweeney, or the Flying Squad, as a proper title, was riven with corruption. And they, when the Operation Countryman finally came in to try and kick out the multitude of bad apples in the Met, it took them 10 or 15 years to prosecute or just chuck out of the force the guys who were skimming off the proceeds. Now, one of the things that the Sweeney were known for was taking a percentage of the profits. So stuff they recovered, bullion, drugs, money, 10% of it could easily disappear before it ever made it into the property store. But they weren't the only department. And have you ever heard, you guys, of the Obscene Publication Squad?
I've heard of the Act.
Squad.
I've heard of the Act, but and obviously that's the squad that policed it. Tell us more about that.
The Dirty Squad, perfectly aptly named for the streets, their job was supposed to be to stamp down on the pornography that was coming in lorry loads every day through Felixstowe from Scandinavia, all the smutty mags. But they decided it was actually much more in their interests to do a license deal with the two principal pornographers, guys called Silvers and Humphreys. And they literally protected Silvers and Humphreys. They kept out the upstart opposition, but they skimmed off a percentage of the profits. And when Operation Countryman finally cleaned out that particular barrel, there were coppers from the very top of the squad, right down to the bobbies on the beat, who were found to be taking £5 notes in dirty envelopes to protect these guys. So this was, as you described it, was a wild west of British justice. And then there were the judges. I haven't even mentioned the judges and the almost institutional bias that some of them demonstrated against the defence, because they just simply didn't believe that men in blue uniforms would beat up suspects and take profits and facilitate crime. So there was an almost impossible task facing defence barristers when they're trying to put forward these the truth of what was happening on the streets.
No, so you've got the corrupt establishment, but the other side of the coin is you've got some of the toughest organised crime leaders in history. Two brothers in particular, the Krays. Now, you're not the first author to put them centre stage in books, but I have to say, and I absolutely love these books. You do it superbly well. The Krays. So you've got a corrupt police force, and you've got vicious criminal gang leaders. As you say, a perfect environment for your books.
It's also one of the things I love particularly about writing about the 60s is there was no DNA evidence, there was no police computer, blood analysis was in its early stages, there was no mobile phones. So detectives, people trying to unravel crime, had to detect. They couldn't rely on some clever piece of scientific evidence. And if you read some of the classic authors like Chandler, whose detectives they're not brilliant scientifically, and they can't rely on any technology. They have to rely on their understanding of human nature. And that's what makes really, in my mind, that's what makes a really interesting detective. A person who can unravel the people's motives and understand human beings.
Not just waiting for the DNA to come in.
Exactly. So that's what excites me about the period. There's also, which we haven't mentioned yet, the fact there's a huge autobiographical element in this, because my family was, for 450 years, they were Cockneys. They arrived in this country in 1492. And they stayed there for essentially 500 years. They in the East End. So my great-uncles boxed at the same gym as the Cray twins. One of them became a professional boxer. And a number of my family members still have dealings with ex and now aged members of the Cray gang.
Gosh.
So this is part of my history as well.
Wow. So, well, not only that, it's part of your professional life. I mean, at the centre of your book is your anti-hero, Charles Holborne. And as I said in the introduction, on a daily basis, he faces class and religious prejudices. Would you like to explain that?
Well, yeah, it's true. I've deliberately exaggerated his circumstances by setting him back a few years from when I started the bar. But when I started in 1978, there was enormous class and religious prejudice. You have to have a picture of what the bar was like then. There were no women. I mean, my chambers didn't have a single woman there. I was the very first non-public school boy ever to be taken into chambers. In fact, I still probably hold the record because I'm the only barrister who ever started life as a London Borough council worker. I had to raise the money to pay for my each succeeding term at university and then at bar school by working as a labourer for the London Borough of Barnet. So I got Christmas, Easter and the summer holidays doing that sort of thing, cutting lawns and washing cars, anything I could do to raise the money. So you can imagine what it was like in these the temples of the law, all these Oxbridge public school boys with, by and large, loads of money, and how they had to deal with this upstart with a Cockney accent, which you can imagine I lost pretty damn quickly, without the right connections. Hadn't been to the right schools, hadn't been to the right university. I didn't know all the people in the hunting and shooting set. I had basically used my sharp elbows to muscle my way into the most established profession there was. And it was a real shock to find I was a subject of such prejudice. So I've used that. I take that back and I use that. Charlie Horowitz, as he was, he changes his name so as to make himself less obviously Jewish. He found, I've used what happened to me as the basis of his sense of alienation of not belonging.
Well, and one of the things I love about the book also is, although it's a legal drama and there are wonderful scenes that beautifully researched, well, not even researched, you'll know them like the back of your hand, but it still takes a lot of researching, I should imagine, because there are other people's cases. The court scenes are, it's not all one long court scene. Really, it's the private life of Charles. I mean, in the brief, it's to do with his wife's murder and the wrongful accusation, which and it's the sheer emotional pull of that story and the huge stresses and strains on his life while continuing to be the best lawyer he can possibly be. That's the sort of dichotomy in those books that I find absolutely fascinating to see, the man at home and the man at work and the struggles that he has. And you bring that you bring it very vividly to life. And so, but did you actually do murder cases yourself? Were you in your early days? Yes.
No, most of the cases that I deal with in the books are cases on which I have worked, or in which I've been involved. I don't take the entire case. What I essentially do is I'm following the story through the 60s, and I'm using real political events, and I'm weaving Charles into that history, using cases in which I was myself involved. So the first book in the series, called The Brief, relates a story of what they call in the trade a cutthroat defence. And that's when two people are each accused of the crime, but the prosecution don't know which one of them did it, and they each blame the other. In that particular case, I was involved in it was an armed robbery, which went wrong, and one of the robbers produced a real gun and shot dead a security guard. And then each of the two robbers blamed the other. One of them was lying, and one was telling the truth. So that's a cutthroat defence. So I use that as the key that sets the plot running in that book. But you're right, it's most of the reviews I get, some people enjoy them because they're fast-paced thrillers and they have a legal element. They're not courtroom dramas, so to speak, but they have a courtroom element in. But the majority of people seem to like them because they like Charles. The reviews I receive are all about, I can't wait to see what happens to Charles. And I love Charles, although he's a really damaged and flawed character. He's a guy who's just trying to do his best in a sea of corruption all around him, like Sam Spade, if you like, or Philip Marlowe. People who adhere to their own moral course despite everything that's going on around them, and even if it means sometimes they break the law or they break the rules to get to the justice of a situation. So it's nice of you to say so, but I don't think it is he who really carries a series.
Right. Well, I mean, it's interesting, this, because he's not only that, he's sort of changed as the series has gone on. In the brief, he's, how can I put this? He's an old-fashioned boy, certainly when it comes to
that's one way of putting it.
Views on women and what have you. But over the series of the books, he changes through circumstances and because of the nature of the 60s as well. Was that meant, or was that just evolved through each book?
No, that's deliberate. I mean, he's a man of his time. And let's face it, there was a lot of misogyny. Women were supposed to make a home. They weren't anticipated to have a career. The man ran the household and usually managed the money and so on. And I wanted to demonstrate, I want to show what that was like. But at the same time, you can't make him too much of a dinosaur or the readership will go off him. And so I wanted to show him growing as time goes by, and as the 60s goes by, and women get a much greater prominence in society in terms of jobs and their ability to dictate their own circumstances. I wanted to show him gradually coming out, if you like, of the post-war sense and into the modern day. On the other hand, he's a flawed character. I mean, he does his best, but basically, as you can see. He screws up his relationships regularly. He never seems to learn. In the one that's about to come out in Corrupted, I'd like to put a sort of moral question at the heart of each book, and in this one, he has his head turned by a very glamorous, very sexy, and rather dangerous woman. So I'm afraid poor Charlie never really learns the lessons of life, although he really tries his best.
Corrupted, you mentioned there. That's coming out very soon, isn't it? Tell us a bit more about that.
Yes, it's coming out on the 21st. I've taken a slight departure in this one, in that I've used a real case. I don't know if you guys watched Very English Scandal, with Hugh Grant portraying Jeremy Thorpe MP.
I've seen two. I've got the last one to watch.
It's on next up on my list, my ever-growing Sky Q list.
Yes, to be watched list. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I recommend it highly. Because it's a very accurate portrayal of an establishment cover-up. Wow. Now, this one is similar. And also a true story. You may have heard that the Cray twins, Ronnie of whom was certainly gay, and out at a time when most of the rest of the gay community was still locked into a closet, they were having sex parties at his flat in Cedra Court, and it turned out that C11, the new intelligence unit set up by Scotland Yard, were watching the twins, and were astonished to find that visitors to the court, to Cedric Court, included MPs such as Tom Dryburgh, who's a chair of the Labour Party, Robert Boothby, who was then Baron Boothby, who used to be Churchill's PPS, and the rest of the guest list read something like out of Who's Who. There were churchmen, there were lawyers, and so on. And they were engaging in these sex parties with a lot of underage young men present. And the whole thing was subject to a massive cover-up. It was an astonishing combination of events where the interests of the Conservative Party, still reeling from the Profumo affair only a few months earlier, the Labour Party, which expected to be the government shortly, which indeed it was. So Harold Wilson was essentially the PM in waiting, and the Cray twins all combined to result in a massive cover-up and one of the largest, I think it was the largest libel damages ever paid to Bob Boothby, wrongly, because he was as guilty as charged. But nonetheless, it's a true story, and I have woven Charles in it. He's defending what is essentially a rent boy or a boy who's been abused on a murder charge. So this is a slight departure in that I've taken real events. And Bob, you mentioned earlier the degree of research required. This one took a great deal more research because I wanted to get it absolutely right. And most of the actors in the drama are now dead, but nonetheless, I didn't want to get even the slightest facet of it wrong. So I've taken a story and I've woven Charles within it. So it's a thriller with political shadowing over it. It also ends with a period in court. So it's a slight new departure for me.
That sounds like just my kind of thing.
Well, it sounds right up my cup of tea, as I say. Now, here's a question I'd like to ask before we move on to what the next week's going to bring about as regards in the next month with the launch of Corrupted.
Yes.
Is the Americans in the US, they have many highly skilled, best-selling authors. The top of the chain, obviously, being John Grisham, who I've already mentioned on this podcast earlier. Tell me, what do you think it is? The main difference that there are far fewer crime writers who actually specialise in legal dramas in this country than there are in the States. It must be the showbiz element of American courtrooms, etc. And it can't just be the perceived at times stuffier men in wigs protocol of British law. Why is that? We have John Mortimer, but we have very few other writers who, like yourself, specialise in this particular area. Why do you think that is?
I'm not sure, but I have a suspicion that it's to do with the rather arcane nature of the bar. In America, there is no division between what we have here, solicitors and barristers. So the chap that you go and see, the lawyer you go and see, he's the man who will do the investigation. He will get the witness evidence together. He will do everything up to and including the presentation in court. So there have been some wonderful American movies. I can't remember the name of that, the one with Paul Newman, where he played a washed-up drunk lawyer who got hold of a big...
The Verdict.
That's it.
With James Mason. Well done. Brilliant, yes.
That's right. So that sort of thing doesn't happen in England. And I think most members of the public struggle to understand the difference between solicitors and barristers. It also means that the barrister, who I'm writing about, it doesn't do any of the investigation. He is not, on the surface of it, a detective, whereas as a lawyer in America can be the detective as well, because he's actually going to put the evidence together. So I think the British system, or the English system, is on the face of it, less accessible. But as Mortimer has demonstrated, and I hope I am too, you can still make it absolutely riveting if you allow your central character to go outside the boundaries of the courtroom. And I do that because I make this Charles's milieu. He counts among his friends robbers, and villains, and so on, just as much as he does members of the bar and the nobility. So he has a foot in both camps, and therefore he gets to see a lot more of what's going on, and also having a relationship with the Crays. I touch on that particularly in Corrupted, because Charles and the Cray twins are both, they started their lives as amateur boxers. Ronnie and Reggie were both very good amateur boxers, and it used to be said of Reggie that he could actually have been a champion. He was a very good, skilled boxer, whereas Ronnie was a bit of a slugger. But I put Charles as a childhood friend, or at least associate of these guys, so he knows what's going on. So when you weave a plot around Charlie, he not only does he do the courtroom stuff, but he does some of the other stuff as well. And I think that's why I've managed to crack it, whereas others can't. For them, it has to be pure courtroom drama.
Well, I mean, as I say, I think they're absolutely wonderful, and it's the Corrupted is out next week. You have your launch at Waterstones in Piccadilly in London, and very nice. That's going to be too. Before we finish, where else are you going to be? You're going to be travelling around the country in the next month promoting the book.
I do, yes. I have a one-man show. In which I talk about my family history, which informs the books, and my own life at the bar and some of the cases that I've worked on. And I bring in all the books and show how they illustrate things that happened to me. So I've got this one-man show, and that's going to Manchester, Leeds, Newcastle, Northampton and Hitchin. So over the next couple of weeks, I think I may have missed a few out, but they're on my website. And so that's all very exciting. It looks finally as if I might have just got my head peeping over the parapet, as we all know, and making yourself difference in a very crowded market when anyone can upload any old thing to the internet is quite tricky.
Well, it is, but you're doing it in a unique way, and you're actually telling stories which are different. And for people throughout the world who may just think, "Oh, that's the British legal system," these are great thrillers. It's not all just protocol and boring courtroom. These are real characters, vividly represented, and a great slice of British history in the 1960s, when life was very different to the way it is today, brought vividly to life in these 4 books. So, Simon, fantastic. All we'll say is thanks for joining us today, and for all listeners, if anyone has enjoyed a very English scandal with Hugh Grant, they'll love Corrupted and the 3 other books in this wonderful Charles Holborne series with Charles Holborne. Thank you, Simon, for joining us. It's been great fun.
Well, thank you both very much indeed.
Well, that book does sound great, Bob, and I'm very much looking forward to going to Solomon's book launch in London next week. That's going to be great fun.
Yes, apparently we might be doing some acting,
yes.
or you will. I think we'll keep that under wraps.
If you are around next week, though, it might be worth popping down to Waterstones in Piccadilly on the 21st.
Yes,
because,
well, it certainly is.
We'll both be there, and we'll be doing a little turn, won't we?
It's a great store. I mean, it really is a flagship. It's like walking into a huge ocean liner, isn't it? Just with obviously, as you'd imagine, in a bookshop, books everywhere. But anyway, they put on a good night out, and Simon certainly does. So
let's just hope the trains are a bit better.
Yeah, well,
they've been slightly unreliable in this neck of the woods, haven't they, recently? So let's hope they're improved.
Well, there we go. Are we really talking about train timetables?
Well,
I know the rest of the nation is, and I know we can't seem to actually get a train to run on time anywhere in the country at the moment, as everyone's saying. But anyway, there we are.
We have to find a niche, Bob.
That's it. Someone write a crime novel about corruption in high places in rail franchises, and give some excuse for the fact that you can't get the 1817 from Flitwick to Crawshaw Booth or wherever you happen to be travelling. Anyway, so yes, well, that was absolutely fantastic interview with Simon Michael there. I just wanted to say with Corrupted, I'll just give a little bit of background to that. Corrupted is the 4th book, as we've pointed out in the Charles Holborne series, and is a follow-up to Simon's best-selling The Lighterman. Now, Charles is building his reputation as a brilliant murder trial lawyer and living the good life with partner Sally, but he can't escape the influence and dangers of the past and finds himself drawn once more into the orbit of the notorious Cray twins. It's not long before Charles is courting scandal and threats to this very life when investigating a sex ring that involves not just the Crays and the mafia, but goes to the very echelons of the country's power. Simon Michael brings the past back to life across a beautifully rendered swinging 60s. London swings like a pendulum do. I think that's the right lyrics, but it's the wrong tune. Never mind. And delivers a gripping piece of thriller fiction that will excite any fan of the genre. So that's Corrupted, out on the 21st. Though I would say, if you're going to read his books, you can read them in any order. Start with the brief and work your way through.
All singing and all dancing on this show, we are.
We are. And I just to add to this, I've got my own very quick little personal story. I met a Cray once.
Did you?
Yes. Not many people know this, but I did. My girlfriend, when I was 18, her father was in shipping, a lovely chap, and used to go to a club just off Liverpool Street. And one night we met up. And he said, "Come along to the club, and we'll have some food and buy you a drink, and then we'll catch the train back to Southend." And there, sitting in the corner, was this very distinguished-looking gentleman, and my girlfriend's father said, "Oh, come on, meet Charlie." So we sat down there and we spent 2 hours with this gentleman. He was absolutely charming. I had no idea who he was, but he was fascinating and hugely entertaining. And so we left. And as I left, my girlfriend's father and I said, "Do you know who that is?" They said, "That was Charlie Cray, brother of the Craytons." And so there we are. That's the nearest I've ever got. I don't know much about Charlie Cray.
Well, apparently Charlie Cray still tells a story about the time he met Robert Dawes in a nightclub in London.
Not again. Yeah. If he's on the Graham Norton show again, telling that story, I know he was on Letterman a couple of times with the Robert Dawes Cray brothers story.
Yeah.
Never mind.
It's all over his Wikipedia.
I thought I was trying to tell it afresh for our listeners.
Yeah, from a different angle.
From a slightly different angle. There we are.
But yeah, Simon's books are all available on Kobo. Head over to kobo.com, find one of his books and enter the promo code CRIME at the checkout to get 90% off and see what all the fuss is about. He's been doing very well. I think Amazon #1, one of his most
Yes, he's doing
books,
very well. The book's proving very popular. Get them while you can.
Yeah, if you want to get in touch with the show, by the way, to suggest a guest or just to tell us how much you love us, you can email hello@partnersincrime.online. We're on Facebook, facebook.com/partnersincrime podcast, and we're on Twitter @crimeficpodcast. I think that'll do for another week.
Well, I would have thought so. I think it's... I'm going to have a nice cup of coffee now. Adam makes a very nice cup of instant coffee.
I've got very good stirring action.
And excellent stirring action. And so we're going to have a downtime. I might even treat myself to a very, very naughty digestive. But, hey, life's for living.
Or hobnobs in the garden.
I wouldn't go that far.
Partners in Crime was presented by Adam Croft and Robert Dawes and produced by Adam Croft. The theme tune was by the Caesareans. The Partners in Crime logo and imagery were designed by Stuart Bache. Partners in Crime is sponsored by Kobo, your favourite local bookshop, perfected.